This week, we read the end of the book of Genesis, Parshat Vayechi. It's called Vayechi, again, because it is the first word of this week's Parsha. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim sheva esrei shana. Vayechi yemei Yaakov shnei chayav sheva shanim ve'arba'im u'ma'at shana. Jacob lived, that's what Vayechi means, lived, and he lived, and lived Jacob 17 years in the land of Jacob, so that the span of Jacob's life came to 147 years. So Jacob dies at this point. It's interesting that as it approaches the time for Jacob to die, and so it first starts saying Vayechi, and Jacob lived, just like when it announces that Sarah dies, just before it says Chaye Sarah, the life of Sarah. So there's this mention of life before there's the mention of death. But Jacob dies, and as you know, this story of Joseph was one of 12 brothers. He's sold into slavery, and now his brothers, who've been reunited with Joseph because of the famine that occurred, and they came down to Egypt looking for food. Now they're afraid that Joseph might finally take revenge, but that is not the case. So we read near the end of the book of Genesis. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong that we did him?" So they sent this message to Joseph. "Before his death, your father left this instruction, saying, 'So shall you say to Joseph, forgive, I urge you, the offense and guilt of your brothers who treated you so harshly. Therefore, please forgive the offense of the servants of the God of your father.' And Joseph was in tears as they spoke to him. His brothers went to him themselves, flung themselves before him and said, 'We are prepared to be your slaves.' But Joseph said to them, 'Have no fear. Am I a substitute for God? Besides, although you intended me harm, God intended it for good, so as to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. And so fear not, I will sustain you and your children.' Thus he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. So Joseph and his father's household remained in Egypt. Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph lived to see the children of the third generation of Ephraim. The children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were likewise born upon Joseph's knees. At length, Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am about to die. God will surely take notice of you and bring you up from this land to the land that God promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob.' So Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, 'When God has taken notice of you, you shall carry up my bones from here.' Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Vayamat Yosef ben me'et ve'eser shanim, v'chantu otoho, vayisem ba'aron, b'Mitzrayim. And as we say when we finish a book, Chazak, Chazak, v'nit chazek. Strength, strength, and be strengthened. A few paragraphs came across my desk, or I should say my desktop, this week about the Parsha. Some of you may remember the Jewish catalog from the 1970s. Does anyone remember the Jewish catalog? The Jewish catalog. Ultimately, there were 3 Jewish catalogs. The New York Times described it as a cross between the Whole Earth catalog and the Babylonian Talmud. In any case, it actually sparked a little bit of a renaissance in do-it-yourself Judaism in the American Jewish world in the 1970s. And that was written by 3 editors, Michael Strassfeld being one of them. And later, when I was at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Michael Strassfeld also started attending the college, and he became a Reconstructionist rabbi. And Rabbi Michael Strassfeld sent out these few paragraphs on this section, which I wanted to begin by sharing with you. The book of Breshit, Genesis, begins and ends in darkness. In the beginning, the world is described as, quote, darkness over the deep, choshech al pnei hatachom. The book ends with the death of Joseph as his body is placed in a coffin, vaisem ba'aron b'Mitzrayim, and ending in darkness. That is itself a dark foreshadowing of the experience of Israelite slavery in Egypt, as described in the book of Exodus. Ever since creation, we live in a world of light and darkness, but it is light and darkness mixed together. And with the two together, we have a world of shadows. In such a world, it can be hard to see clearly. Our eyes are deceived by the ever-changing mixture of light, dark, and shadows. Light itself is a flickering flame, restless, seemingly searching this way and that, never standing still, ever changing. This world, then, is one of seeing and not seeing, of the hidden and revealed. How then to see in a world of shadows? Some people sharply divide the world into light and darkness and label things accordingly. However, to see the world that way is to deny its reality. For the light and darkness are ever changing, just as every 24-hour period turns from night into day and back into night. Joseph's brothers call him Baal HaChalmot, Baal HaChalamot, master of dreams. Joseph is someone with vision, who was able to see clearly the interplay between light and darkness, who, despite the blackest dark, can find his way. Unlike every other character in his story, his brothers, his father, or Potiphar, Joseph cannot be deceived. Who better to interpret dreams, the place of the intersection of the conscious and the unconscious, in which everything is covered with a veil of confusing shadows? That vision allows him to forgive his brothers by seeing everything that has happened to him as part of his life. It is Joseph's story we are to carry with us from Genesis, perhaps even more than that of the patriarchs. For the patriarchs' vision is a narrow vision that causes them to divide the world into white and black, into chosen and unchosen. But like his coat of many colors. Joseph lives in technicolor and thus embraces all of his brothers. The very end of the book of Genesis ends with Joseph being placed in an aron, a coffin. The Jewish people at this point are about to enter long years of darkness without seeing any possible hope. Enslavement in Egypt. It is not only a new Pharaoh who forgets Joseph, but the Israelites forget Joseph as well. They have forgotten to dream and to search for their inner light. Moses, another assimilated Jew who grew up in Pharaoh's palace, turns aside to see the light of a burning bush that is on fire and yet not consumed. Moses will bring the light of a promised land to the Israelites. And when they leave, they will take with them the coffin of Joseph. On the journey, they will transform darkness to light by building an ark, which is the same word as coffin, aron, to hold the tablets containing the commandments. And they will dream of what could be. The words of Rabbi Michael Strassfeld, which I thought were so beautiful. I wanted to share them with you and continue in that theme, reflecting on this week. For as American Jews, this week, we marked two holidays this week, one happy and one sad. One of light, perhaps, and one of darkness. We marked New Year's Day, known in Israel, however, as Sylvester. So we can really tell that this day is not part of the Jewish calendar. The name Sylvester does not sound very Hebraic. However, the only way to say New Year's Day in Hebrew is Rosh Hashanah, head of the year. But that name is taken. Sylvester becomes the name for New Year's Day on the European, the Roman calendar. From what I can tell, this comes from Saint Sylvester's Day on the Catholic calendar. December 31st is Saint Sylvester's Day. So in Israel, the very language reveals that this day, Sylvester, is an imported occasion from Europe, literally the Roman New Year. And as such, it is about endings and beginnings, leading into January, the month of Janus, the two-faced Roman god of beginnings and endings. And like Rosh Hashanah celebrations, sometimes involve, and like Rosh Hashanah, Sylvester celebrations sometimes involve wine and hats and horns. On January 1st, Sylvester, we have champagne, party hats, and party horns. And on Rosh Hashanah, Kiddush wine, kippot, and shofar blasts. We make New Year's resolutions on Sylvester, and we do heavy tshuva on Rosh Hashanah. Similar themes, but everything is weighted a bit differently. Rosh Hashanah is a bit more on the tshuva and recommitment. Sylvester is a bit more on the eat, drink, and be merry, for this year we didn't die. But for all that New Year's, Day does feel like a marker in time. It does feel like a marker in time for most of us, because the Western calendar is so much part of our rhythm of life. The second holiday we marked this week was of a very different nature. This past Tuesday was the 10th day of Tevet, the 10th of Tevet. This is the anniversary of the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar in the lead up to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 586 BCE. The 10th of Tevet, this past Tuesday, is a day of fasting from sunrise to sunset. And in an interesting quirk of the calendars, by the way, there was no 10th of Tevet 2022 this year. 10th of Tevet was January 3rd, 2023. And next 10th of Tevet is December 23rd, 2023. So there was no 10th of Tevet 2022, but there will be two 10ths of Tevet in 2023. The 10th of Tevet is the beginning of the cycle of fasts leading to the 9th of Av in the middle of the summer. The 10th of Tevet, the siege of Jerusalem began. The 17th of Tammuz, which is June or July, the walls of Jerusalem were breached. And in the 9th of Av, 3 weeks later, in July or August, the temple was destroyed. Each of these days is a reminder of brokenness in the world, of exile, physical exile from the land and from each other, and spiritual exile from ourselves, from each other, and from God and goodness. The 10th of Tevet is also the day when traditionally we remember the yortzites of all those whose yortzites are not known. For that reason, it was proposed after the Holocaust that the 10th of Tevet be a day for remembering the Holocaust. For many, it still is a day for remembering those who died in the Holocaust, but it is not known exactly when they died. When Rabbi Strassfeld references darkness, I think of the darkness that we are commemorating also in the 10th of Tevet. But as I read those words and I thought of the 10th of Tevet, the 10th of Tevet this year was also the day when the Israeli Minister of National Security, who was a right-wing religious nationalist and an admirer of people who have committed tremendous violence, decided to go up on the Temple Mount and begin to cause havoc. Anything to do with the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is very complicated, and so needs to be handled with great sensitivity unless you are willing to risk someone's life or limb. I greatly suspect that the Israeli Minister of National Security thought the 10th of Tevet was the right day to create such havoc, because the Temple Mount, to many religious nationalists, represents a Jewish possession which will be rebuilt and returned to the Jewish people in the age of the Messiah. And many of them really are willing to push that envelope and risk that violence in their attempt to bring forward that day, which they think of as redemption. I, on the other hand, see what the National Security Minister did as an example of the darkness and brokenness for which we were mourning on that very 10th of Tevet. He, rather than being an example of the power of redemption, was representing the forces of darkness, bitterness, and brokenness in the world. My vision of the Temple Mount, a vision which I believe we all should be proclaiming much more loudly, especially given the nature of the government that was newly established in Israel also this week. My vision comes from Isaiah chapter 2, which reads, "In the days to come, the mount of the Lord's house shall stand firm above all the mountains and tower above the hills. And all the nations shall gaze upon it with joy, and the many peoples shall go and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that God may instruct us in God's ways, and that we may walk in God's paths. For Torah will come forth from Zion, ki mitzion tetzei Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, udvar Adonai mirushalayim. Thus God will adjudicate among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. Lo yisagoy el goy cherev. They shall never again know war. Lo yilmadu od milchama. This is the end of history vision we should be striving for, not the narrow self-aggrandizing vision of the religious nationalists, which shows no honor to others and is more likely to lead to war than to justice and peace. Tradition makes it clear no iron was to be used in the construction of the temple because iron was a tool of war. How much more then should we not start a war in order to see a new temple come about? We need to remember more than ever the rabbinic teaching, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zelazeh. All the people of Israel are responsible for each other. We are responsible to care for each other, and we are responsible for what other Jews do in our name. With so much happening these days in the world and in America, since, by the way, today is also January 6th, the second anniversary of an actual attempt to overthrow the functioning of government. With all of this happening in the world, in America, but in this case also particularly in Israel, we cannot sit by and be silent, doing nothing when other Jews are doing terrible things in our name. When it comes to Israel in particular, we have to draw closer than ever to the problem. No longer can we sit by saying there is nothing we can do. For now, there is something we have to do. At the end of the book of Genesis, which we read this week, Joseph says to his brothers, God surely will take notice of you and bring you up from this land to the land that God promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, when God has taken notice of you, carry up my bones from here. We carry each other's bones. That is what it means to be community. We are part of each other. That is what it means to be a people. Somehow we relate to each other. We are related to each other. Bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh, figuratively, if not literally. What one of us does affects the rest of us. And when it contributes to darkness, we have to let them know. So as we conclude the book of Genesis this week and turn to the book of Exodus, where we will read of coming out of Egypt and our approach to Sinai, let us seek to find our voice. Chazak, chazak, v'nitchazek. Shabbat shalom.